Okay, we're good. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, boys and girls. Well, class, how are we all doing today? Yes, I'm aware. Yes, I'm aware of that too. So, tonight, because it's been so heavily sponsored, yeah, well, we'll talk about sanctions and why sanctions don't really work in this particular case. Sanctions. Interesting this time. Let's actually interesting this time, but do they work? Tilda, there we go. and I mean, to be fair, the answer is no, they don't work. But there's a reason why they're interesting this particular time. Oh, maybe not 12. Let's have like 15. And also, can you not laugh at me? Remember, I still have a broken finger. Like there's a reason why I can barely type. If it were because if it were because I couldn't type because I'm not a good enough human like you, then sure, by all means laugh at me. But I'm not. I'm a decentish human, so. Anyway, so let's start with why it's interesting this time, because it's actually interesting. Why is it interesting this time? Well, yeah, right. Like that's kind of the point, because, and we'll get to that. Just give me one quick second. Russia is the first developed-ish country to be subjected to SWIFT sanctions. Well, I mean, not just SWIFT, to global sanctions, including SWIFT, right? And so that's what makes it interesting, because Russia is an industrialized country compared to previous, how do we call them, recipients. Russia has a much more developed economy, more integrated with the world. Therefore, it will be interesting. Yeah, I've seen Volodymyr talking about that, actually. The the invitation for all foreigners who want to fight for Ukraine to go. And interestingly enough, Liz Truss, right, the girl who's hankering after Boris Johnson's job, is I think just today said that any Briton that wants to go join that, the government will actually support them. And obviously, she didn't say how. All she said was that the government will support them, and I take that to mean that the government will fund their travel, will, I don't know, outfit them in gear, etc., etc. That would be really interesting, right? Because then Britain would be essentially directly, funneling resources, not just arms and material, but actual manpower into the fight. And then you get into this really interesting gray area of, if a British national is fighting Russia in Ukraine, does that necessarily mean that now suddenly there is an incentive for Russia to interpret that as a NATO attack, right? And that's important, right? And that is sort of a path of escalation that I feel is that I feel is highly destabilizing, right? Like we've talked about this yesterday. We'll talk about it today again. We never expected our boy Vladimir to attack Ukraine because of all of these sanctions that are now being applied, because of um, the depth of the Ukrainian defense, because of the economic damage that it would do to Russia, to himself, to all of his oligarch friends. And so the fact that he did, knowing full well that all of this was coming, means a few things, right? Like we've seen talk about him being unpredictable, about him being crazy. We've seen Trump call him a very smart guy. Um, well, Trump, to me, Trump calling him a smart guy is actually one of those very defining moments, because Trump made his own based his own political career on being unpredictable, on being sort of um, fighting from outside of the status quo, right? And and I mean, say what you will about Donald, he's not stupid. That's a completely different question. The point is that Vladimir, we never expected him to attack Ukraine, and so therefore, if a British national is caught fighting Russian soldiers in Ukraine, does that and does that create an incentive for Vladimir to essentially parade that fact in front of his own people as justification for war with NATO, right? And that would be terrible, right? Because the first ones to go will be Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and then Poland, because there's Kaliningrad right to the north of Poland, between Poland and Lithuania, and there's that gap. Oh, I can't remember the name of that gap. But anyway, the gap between Belarus and Kaliningrad, and if you can bet that if war with NATO came, obviously that entire area would be in trouble, and then it would go into Poland, blah blah. But the one redeeming fact is that I don't think it will happen, simply because Ukraine is taking up so much Russian force, right? Like essentially the amount of forces that Vlad placed around Ukraine is, yeah, actually I can't remember. I think it was either 75% or 80%, maybe less than 80, of his of the entire Russian armed forces, something like that. Correct me if I'm wrong. Yes, Sidewinder, my friend, but that doesn't matter, right? Just because they're under the Ukrainian flag means nothing if Vladimir can use that as a pretext, right? It doesn't, as long as he can just he has the evidence that this guy used to be a British person. That's enough. Because remember, this is not about truth anymore, right? Like, this war has never been about truth to begin with. And so, because it's never been about truth, and I mean, war has always been, in at least since the dawn of the 20th century, war has always been about galvanizing your own population so that you have more manpower to throw into the field and wear out the other guy's manpower, right? That's literally all it was since World War One. And well, that and so he doesn't. No, let me finish this, right? And I know you're. Sorry, not you, Sidewinder, but someone else is also arguing this point. I know you're arguing that that's not the truth, but again, it doesn't need to be the truth. It just needs to be close enough to the truth, such that it is not easily debunked, right? Like, if you take a Chinese person, or no, okay, let's say you take one of the Cossacks, and you plant that body there, and you give him a British passport, etc. That is not convincing. But if you can find this entire British person's social media profile dating him all the way back to 2000, and you throw that all into the open, that will justify because remember, Vladimir since the very beginning has been talking about NATO surrounding Russia and NATO attacking Russia. And so by essentially this entire foreign legion concept, and yes, I know we're completely off the topic of sanctions. We'll get back to that in a moment. This entire foreign legion concept would, in my mind at least, play into the information war that is happening at the same time. It might not work in the West, but Vladimir doesn't need it to work in the West. It just needs to work within Russia itself, right? And so, yeah, there's a bunch of nuance there that we really don't have time to get into. So, yes. Give me 1 second. Whoa, how long did it take? Yeah, until 11:15. False flag NATO from the Ukrainian war. So we'll set that to that. Okay. So let's. Okay, well, we can discuss that in private offline after the broadcast. Let me just finish talking about the sanctions, why they don't work, right? First, why it's interesting this time. Let's see. Even some of, yeah. So therefore, it would be interesting when the elite truly lose their connections to the West, when a disciplined central bank, and remember, the central bank has been very, very disciplined since 2014, when the annexation of Crimea happened. So a very disciplined central bank faces the cut of their sovereign reserves. So all of these are very, very interesting topics because, and we'll give some examples about why sanctions don't work, but those are all, or mostly all, with countries that don't have all of these like they weren't ever as developed, except for Venezuela. But by the time the sanctions truly came into force, Venezuela had been sort of run into the ground by Hugo Chavez. So that's, well, and Nicolas Maduro. But that's a slightly different topic, right? So for all intents and purposes, Russia is really the first developed country, industrialized, developed-ish, industrialized. What was my next one? And the one, call it confounding factor, is Crimea 2014, right? So we've talked about that, blah 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 blah. So let's talk about why sanctions don't work. No, thank you. No, thank you. Why sanctions do not? Okay, let's. I'm probably not going to go through all of these examples, like in full, but we'll just so you know, right? Let's talk about it. Around Carter administration, Venezuela, Trump, North Korea, ages ago. Actually, let's add Cuba to this as well, ages ago, and Syria, Obama. Right, so the countries that were sanctioned along with the administration that they were sanctioned within. So Iran obviously was for the Iranian Revolution that deposed the Shah in 1970, whatever. Venezuela was, of course, Maduro, and well, I mean, Venezuela is a let's put a tilde. So North Korea and Cuba have been sanctioned forever, and Syria was, of course, during the Arab Spring in 2011 that and al-Assad essentially going to war with his own people, etc. Yes, so these examples, why they don't work. Well, I mean, it's not a fun topic. We never said it would be a fun topic, right? Excuse me. It is part of life though, and it has been part of life for the past. Like, these types of sanctions have existed since, I mean, obviously the days of North Korea, right? The days of Cuba, and all like sanctions were very much a tool of the 20th century. Oh, actually, there was one case in which sanctions did kind of work, and that is Afghanistan. After the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, but that's sort of not because of the sanctions, but because of a whole bunch of other structural issues. And then the sanctions then contributed even further to the structural issues, and then a reform-minded leader, in the case of Gorbachev, decided to say, you know what, fuck it, I don't want to go through all of this pain. It takes bravery to do so, right? But having said that, Gorbachev himself, I think, was not brave enough, because the institutions were not in place for the former Soviet republics to become proper democratic states, right? Like, the only real, I think, decent-ish examples are the three Baltic states. Even Poland, up until today, I mean, the PIS has reformed itself recently because the EU threatened it with billions and billions of dollars, and the PIS knows that it cannot really survive without that money. So that's different, right? So even Czechoslovakia didn't really make it. Hungary, definitely Belarus, right? And then all of the Stan countries in middle in on the steppes. It's just, yeah, none of the former Soviet republics were prepared and had the institutions in place to make a transition to democracy. And so, and I'm sorry, I went on about Gorbachev again. So with Gorbachev, yeah, okay, whatever. So we'll talk about that another time. Why sanctions don't work. An oligarchy can maintain its own power within a sanctioned state almost indefinitely. Via sanctions alone, regime change does not happen, and this is quite simply because as the economic pie shrinks, the remainder all goes towards repression. It is always the average people, the middle and lower class, that suffer in a sanctioned state, right? Like, the idea of sanctions is to make life difficult for the rulers, but in states like all of these, including Russia in 2014, it is always the middle and lower class that suffers, because they have to essentially to survive, they have to redevelop their economy from the ground up. And as I said here, right, as the economic pie shrinks, excuse me, the security services will get more and more of that, and therefore they will have more um, and more power, and therefore they will repress more and more. And so that repression is in its own way self-perpetuating in a sanction government. Yeah. 218. So long as most of the security services are kept paid, right? I think that's kind of self-evident. Let's see the measure. So, and then in this case, leaders, especially oh no, let's put it this way: the sanction leader will be embittered and will fight back even harder. I think that's self-evident as well. You know, like we see it time and again. You know, Fidel. We see it in what was his name? Kim Il Sung, Hugo Chavez. You know, all of these good guys, and obviously Vladimir Putin after 2014. Even actually after 2007, you could see that, but obviously I was wrong. And I still maintain that I thought that that was an act to enrich himself and his buddies, and that act was meant to generate that nationalistic tension within Russia so that he would be kept in power, right? It obviously as the days go on, that makes it even like that seems less and less likely. But that's genuinely what I thought. Like, I thought that genuinely smart, if corrupt, leaders would abuse their uneducated lower class and lower middle class to abuse that nationalism to stay in power and to enrich themselves. And that's a very yeah, for the lack of a better word, that's a very human thing to do, right? So well, I mean, I can't think of a better way of saying that. Like, it's an autocrat needs to be kept in power somehow, and the best way to keep himself in power is via support for an external enemy, right? We know for a fact that humans function better with an external enemy. Actually, that can go right here. We'll seek even more external enemies to fight and to gain support, local support. Actually, we can insert talk about British participation in the Ukrainian Legion. When did I start? Was that 2 minutes? Probably 2 minutes to 11 minutes and 15 of this video. There we go. Excellent. So, coincidentally, that's also why Gorbachev was brave, right? I like coincidentally, that's why Gorbachev was brave. But I can't remember the times. Sometime earlier. Okay, cool. What's next? Right. So because of this, it is always the lower / middle class that suffers, since their pivot to save them, say themselves, will also feed those above them, i.e. the security forces, etc. And in this case, we will see a rampant increase in organized crime. People fight for the remaining smaller pie, and therefore the average. So in Chinese, there is a word for the average person. We call that 百姓. So the peoples with 100 first with 100 family names, right? And so the idea is that all of these people. I don't think there is, and it's very specifically meant for the average person, not bureaucrats, not high level bureaucrats, not high level merchants, scientists, whatever, engineers. No, just average, everyday people. But I don't think there's a word for that in pleb. Well, okay, but pleb has sort of negative connotations, right? Like you wouldn't use pleb as a way of just generally talking about the people. You would use it to say, oh, those plebs are really stupid, but that's not the case, right? Average people aren't stupid; they're just most of the time less educated, and that's a unfortunate fact of life. That will suffer first. Okay. What else do I say? Well, use their pivot to save themselves. Feed those above them. Security forces into their new life opportunities. Well, that's not projects to save themselves will be siphoned off by organized crime and corrupt officials. And this is already a thing in Russia. Let's make that clear, right? Like this has already been a thing. So with sanctions, this will only get worse as the bureaucrats, the courts, the police, and the rise in organized crime will then drain off the savings of the average people. Right? Is that right? And so let's talk about especially Russia, why I do not think that this will work in Russia. At least it will not bring about regime change. Yeah, like definitely will not bring about regime change, simply because, well, for these following reasons. Since 2014, Putin himself has been preparing the country for autarky, right? We've seen buy local for a lot, or no, let's not call it buy local. Let's call it what it is: import substitution. Wines, cheeses, commodities, and that's why like Russia had already been on. How do I say? Had already been on that autarkic turn, right? So they have already started this. The most important oligarchs, security services, have already been sanctioned, right? Let's remember, a lot of these guys had, well, like the same guys were in power then as they are now, basically, for all intents and purposes. And so the security forces had already been sanctioned back then, and so these guys have nothing to lose, right? So is it interesting? Good morning, Kotaru. And yeah, it has been interesting. Anyway, so the most important oligarchs, those who control the security services, if we remember it, because this, right? Oh no, wait. Where's repression? Did I not talk about repression up here? Oh no, right here, right here. So, so the guys that are in charge of the security services have already been sanctioned, so they don't really care that much, right? Their personal wealth is either has already been freed or they're already beyond sanctionable distance, so they don't really care. And so if the security services are safe, then the government remains essentially safe, right? Has been sanctioned. Therefore, repression at home is, let's call it safe, because there is very little appetite for protesting. Protests themselves have been shut down. Population is or has become increasingly jaded. And that's a problem, right? Like if the population is jaded, like we've seen protests or we've heard of protests. Excuse me, we've heard of protests in Russia since the start of the war, but those protests were nothing the size of previous ones, the ones that were called when Navalny was still, not locked up. And now with Twitter, YouTube, Facebook starting to be shut down in Russia, things are becoming less and less able to be organized. Does that kind of make sense? Right? Yeah. They have been kind of increasingly jaded. Let's see, what else did I have? I think that's basically all I wanted to say on this topic. Import substitution, the country has been preparing. Oh, I was gonna say that the central bank had built up a substantial reserve, but that reserve has been been stripped recently, right? So let's put a huge, big ugly bottom here. In central bank reserves are in question. Means the economy is in question. Like the ruble, of course, has fallen dramatically since last Thursday, but that I don't think that really has it, or I don't think that will have an immediate effect. If there is an effect, we'll have to wait a while for that to show itself. Let's set this to 22. Oop. Okay. Talk so much. Well, I'm sorry I talk a lot. Actually, I'm not really sorry, and I talk this much because this is what's demanded from me. This is what I get paid for. Like if you want to pay me for playing, if you want to pay me to play video games, maybe you should step up and actually pay me to play video games instead, right? Instead of letting people pay me to talk about these things that are apparently boring and not very helpful. Yeah, blame them. Don't blame me. How dare you blame me? How dare you, sir? Have you no shame? There we go. Okay. So that's actually good call. Let's put that down here. So we are basically done for today. Before we end, any final questions, concerns? Oh, okay, let's put this. Oh no, that's not. What will happen? I have no idea. Genuinely no idea. I don't. So it is my personal opinion and nothing more that I don't think the sanctions will work, and I think that the sanctions will contribute to a humanitarian disaster within Russia. Protesting, blah blah blah. Sanctions will contribute to humanitarian disaster. Right, like Good, excellent. Bye, Quish. Yeah, that's basically all. What if the talks? You mean the ones that were taking place on along the Polish Belarusian border, right? I mean, so far they haven't really done anything, right? Like we've seen them talk, but we actually haven't seen any results from that talk. Like I think all they agreed to was that they would talk more, and that's what a diplomat does. That's simply how diplomacy works. And unfortunately, while those talks get dragged out, both Russian and Ukrainian civilians will suffer. Obviously, Ukrainian civilians will suffer first, and then the Russian civilians will suffer as sort of the economy rebalances itself. I am like perhaps my personal greatest concern is the rise of further organized crime in Russian territories as these sanctions start to smother the economy, right? Because we know from history, we know for a fact that as the economy drains, um, organized crime will run and will take over, and we and in a country that already has these corrupted institutions, from the courts, from the police, from the security services, it then you'll well, or at least I'm of the opinion that we'll see a broadening of that of crime, essentially organized crime and state-sponsored organized crime, right? I mean, we already know for a fact that state-sponsored organized crime is a thing from sanctioned countries, and we know that from North Korea, from Cuba, from Venezuela, Syria, all of these things, right? The state-sanctioned organized crime. And pay their dues to the state, right? And so that makes it a little bit more. And of course, they're not just going to target, you know, the Western countries. They're certainly going to target their own people as well. So that's like that kind of extortionary behavior will only grow. Yes, I know. I don't just ignore the underlines. Anyway, no more questions today. We're already at 38 minutes, so let me just say thank you very much for watching. In conclusion, please download Firefox. Please download Firefox. Please don't do Chrome. And I'm happy to say that I didn't waste 38 minutes of your time today. Bye now.